we're encouraged, it says, to not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Peacemaking is not always an easy process, or doesn't always go as easily as we would like it to. Some people are ready to make peace right away, but there are others that may be stubborn and defensive and resist our efforts to be reconciled. And they might even become more antagonistic and find new ways to frustrate or mistreat us. Now, our natural reaction at that point then, of course, would be to strike back at such people, or at least stop doing anything good toward them. But Jesus calls us to a different course of action. Here, let's open our Bibles to Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6, and first we'll look at verses 27 and 28. Luke 6, verses 27 and 28. But I say unto you which hear, love your enemies, do good to them which hate you, bless them that curse you, pray for them which despitefully use you. And then down to verses 35 and 36. But love your enemies, and do good, and lend, hoping for nothing again, and your reward shall be great, and ye shall be the children of the highest, for he is kind unto the unthankful and to the evil. Be therefore merciful, as your Father also is merciful. So we're called upon not to do what our fallen natures would prompt us to do when someone doesn't respond to our overtures for peacemaking, when they may make things worse for us. Instead of trying to want to get back at them, instead we're still to extend them even further mercy and goodness the way that God has done for us. Let's look now at 2 Corinthians chapter 10. 2 Corinthians 10, and we'll look at verses 3 to 5. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. So even our very thoughts are to be brought into captivity to Christ. So our ways are not God's ways. God has a much higher ideal for us in these things. Then if we go back to where our scripture reading was today, Romans chapter 12, and we're going to begin with verse 14. Romans chapter 12, we're going to begin with verse 14. Bless them which persecute you. Bless and curse not. Rejoice with them that do rejoice. Weep with them that weep. Be of the same mind one toward another. Mind not high things, but condescend to men of low estate. Be not wise in your own conceits. Recompense to no man evil for evil. Provide things honest in the sight of all men. If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath. For it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. So here we see Paul's plan here for how do we deal with those who don't want to make peace with us, who they refuse the overtures that we make. They may even try to make things worse for us. And so as we look down at this, we see that a number of things through this passage that Paul gives us some counsel. The first that we see is we need to control our tongues. He's saying, bless and do not curse them. And the more intense a dispute comes, the more important that actually becomes to do this. Because if we're involved in a prolonged conflict, we really get tempted to indulge in gossip and slander and reckless words. Especially if your opponent is saying those types of things about you. You want to kind of give back in kind. But if we react with harsh words or gossip, we only make matters worse. So even if our opponent is speaking maliciously against us or to us, do not respond in kind. Instead, we want to make every effort to breathe grace by saying only what is both true and helpful. We want to speak well of our opponent whenever possible and using kind and gracious language. Peter also talks about this if we go to 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 9. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 9. Not rendering evil for evil or railing for railing, but contrariwise blessing, knowing that ye are thereunto called, that ye should inherit a blessing. So not railing for railing. Just because they say something bad about us doesn't mean we have to say it back, but instead we're to seek to try to bless them. It says that's what we are called to do. We are called to bless those that curse us. We are called to be loving towards our enemies. That's part of what it means to be a Christian. And so as we control our tongues and don't engage in gossip or backbiting or verbally attacking the other person, it not only prevents further offenses, but controlling our tongue can help us to maintain a loving attitude and an accurate perspective on our situation. So, if we start verbalizing negative things at them, we tend to see them in a more and more negative light. Whereas then if we're trying to think of some good thing we can say about them, refusing to speak negatively about them, that helps us to not slip into that negative mindset concerning them. The second thing that Paul brings out, where he is, talks about that we, seek godly relationships, godly advisors. It's difficult to battle evil alone. So we want to develop relationships with people who will encourage us and give us biblically sound advice. Proverbs chapter 27, verses 5 and 6 also speaks about this. Proverbs 27, and we'll look at verses 5 and 6. Open rebuke is better than secret love. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. Sometimes we need people around us who will tell us what we need to hear, not just what we want to hear. That's one of the things that a lot of politicians fall into. They surround themselves with yes men. They just tell them whatever the politician wants to hear, and just becomes kind of an echo chamber. But sometimes we need friends who are faithful enough to tell us what we need to hear in situations, and they can kind of help to hold us accountable there. So we want to seek out godly friends, godly advisors who can help us out and back us up as we go through this process of dealing with people that may not want to make peace with us. Then we also want to keep on doing what is right. In verse 17 he said, "Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everybody." Now, that does not mean that we're slaves to the opinions of others. The Greek word there means to give thought to the future, to plan in advance, or to take a careful precaution. So what Paul is saying is that we should plan and act so carefully and properly that any reasonable person who's watching you will eventually acknowledge that what you did was right. There. Again, Peter talks about this as well if we go to 1 Peter chapter 2. First Peter 2, and first we'll look at verse 12. 1 Peter 2:12. having your conversation or lifestyle honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. Then dropping down to verse 15. For so is the will of God, that with well-doing you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. And then on to chapter 3, second half of verse 15 and verse 16. But that we are to have answer every man that asks you the reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear, having a good conscience, that whereas they speak evil of you as of evildoers, they may be ashamed that falsely accuse your good conversation in Christ. So we want to keep on doing what is right here. We want to plan carefully so that whatever we do, when people are honestly looking at it, they're going to understand we've done what is right in that particular situation. In 1 Samuel 24, we find a story of David and Saul. That there was a lot of contention there between David and King Saul. David was Saul's son-in-law, but he was also had been chosen by God to replace Saul, and Saul was jealous of David, and so had basically driven him away and was seeking to attack him. And so at one point, David and some of his men are hiding in a cave, and Saul's army is outside there. Well, Saul goes into the cave to relieve himself. And David's men are like, God has put Saul into your hands. Strike him down. But David is looking at that, and he's saying, how can I do that here? That he's the Lord's anointed, and I'm not going to raise my hand up to do that. And David did go down, and he kind of cut off the hem of his garment. So then after Saul goes outside and he's down with his men, David comes out the entrance of the cave, and he calls out to Saul and says, God put you in my hand, but I would not touch the Lord's anointed. I wouldn't kill you. And he showed him the hem of his garment. And Saul responds, says, you're more righteous than I. He says, you treated me well. I have treated you badly. You have just now told me of the good you did to me. The Lord delivered me into your hands, but you did not kill me. When a man finds his enemy, does he let him get away unharmed? May the Lord reward you well for the way you treated me today. I know I know that you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands. So even though Saul hated David, by David's good actions there, it caused him to have to acknowledge that what David did was right. He says, he's basically not saying, hey, I wouldn't have done the same thing in the same circumstances. He says, you're more righteous than I am. And so sometimes it's difficult to keep doing what is right when we could get away with getting even with somebody, getting back at them for what they've done to us. But we're called upon, even in those circumstances, we're called upon to do what is right, even when they're bad-mouthing us and they're saying that we're evil. We don't need to live up to what they're saying about us. We need to live up to what God has called upon us to do and to be. So we keep on doing what is right. John and his wife Karen divorced him. And she moved in with her high school sweetheart. John was devastated, and especially when his church refused to do anything to help save their marriage. But he drew on God's grace, and he resisted the temptation to give in to self-pity and bitterness. He refused to criticize Karen, especially in front of their children. He bent over backwards to accommodate their ever-changing visitation schedule. Most of all, he continued to pray for Karen. And whenever they talked with each other, he asked God to help him speak to her with genuine love and gentleness. After about a year, Karen and her boyfriend were fighting continually. As she compared his behavior to John's unfailing kindness in face of her betrayal, she began to realize what a terrible mistake she had made. With great trepidation, she asked John if there was any chance they could get together again. To her amazement, he said yes, and suggested they start counseling with the pastor at his new church. 8 months later, their children had the joy of seeing their parents renewing their vows and reuniting their family. But whether Karen came back to him or not, John's decision to keep doing what was right honored God. And then his behavior also became a powerful witness to both his children about the love and forgiveness of Christ, and later on, there were other people in the church that his example helped. Some of the other people who responded to their ex-spouses graciously. And that even though none of them came back, it still, protected them from slipping into this negative thinking and criticizing. And too often when divorces happen, that's what happens. A lot of times when there's children involved, it's like each one's trying to criticize the parents in front of the kids to get the kids on their side of the story. But John didn't let himself be swept up into that type of a mentality. He continued to do what was right, even though he'd been so deeply betrayed by her. That's what we're called upon to do, to keep doing what is right, even when we're hurt, even when the other person keeps piling on the hurt. We keep doing what God calls upon us to do. We also need to recognize our limits. Even when we continue to do what is right, some people may adamantly refuse to admit you are right or to live at peace with you. That's why Paul wrote there in verse 18 of Romans 12, if it is possible, as far as depends on you, live at peace with everyone. In other words, do all that you can do to be reconciled to others, but remember, you cannot force others to do what is right. You can't force them to go ahead and choose to be reconciled to you. But when you've done everything in your power to resolve the conflict, you have fulfilled your responsibility to God. And you can stop actively trying to solve the problem. Again, we're still going to keep doing what is right towards the other person, but at some point we have to say, I've done everything that I can, and so I'm just going to, I'm going to be nice, I'm going to do what's right, but it's now in their hands, God. And so we wait for God to work in those circumstances. If the circumstances change and you have new opportunities to seek peace with the opponent, we can certainly try to do so. But in the meantime, it's not necessary or wise to waste time and energy and resources fretting about someone who stubbornly refuses to be reconciled to us. And it's easier for us to accept our limits if we have a biblical view of success. The world defines success in terms of what a person possesses, controls, or accomplishes. God defines success in terms of faithful obedience to His will. The world asks, what results have you achieved? God asks, were you faithful to my ways? God is ultimately, the one who has to work in people's hearts, and He's responsible for the outcomes. He just asks us to do what He asks us to do in each given situation. Ecclesiastes 12:13 tells us, fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. So if we've done all we can do to be reconciled to someone, you have fulfilled your duty and are a success in God's eyes. Let Him take it from there. An essential aspect of recognizing our limits is rejecting the temptation to take personal revenge on someone who is doing wrong, or even to dream about it. Paul reminds us that God is responsible for doing justice and for punishing those who do not repent. We look at Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 22. Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 22. Say not thou, I will recompense evil, but wait on the Lord, and He shall save thee. It's not our job to try to get even with anybody else, to try to pay them back for what they have done for us. No, we leave justice in the hands of God. He said, He says, He will. You trust me, I will take care of it. That's not your job. He says, that's not what I'm calling on you to do. I'm calling on you to keep on doing what is right. Keep doing what I'm asking you. You leave the results in my hand and the responsibility for dealing with the other person in my hands, not in your hands. And so we're called. So we wait on the Lord, and God has many instruments that He can use to bring evil people to justice and deliver us from them. He can use the church. He can use the civil courts. The Bible even talks about turning someone over to Satan. He can even use, letting, wickedness have its way with them. But it's in God's hands to deal with these unrepentant people. So we don't want to try to take justice into our own hands. Instead, we're to respect and cooperate with God's methods for dealing with these people. And finally, we want to use the ultimate weapon. And that's to do good to them. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So the ultimate weapon in our battle with those who refuse to be reconciled to us is deliberate, focused love. Instead of reacting spitefully to those who mistreat you, Jesus wants you to discern their deepest needs and do all you can to meet those needs. Sometimes this will require going to them to show them their faults. Other times, there may be a need for mercy and compassion, patience, and words of encouragement. You may even have opportunities to provide material and financial assistance to those who least deserve it or expect it from you. When Paul talks about burning coals heaped upon their head, this is talking about the irresistible power of deliberate, focused love. In ancient times, armies that were defending a city and stuff, as the enemy soldiers come up, they would oftentimes have pots of coals and things they would literally drop down on their heads. And it's hard to maintain an attack very long in the face of that type of a defense. Love has the same irresistible power. At the very least, actively loving an enemy will protect you from being spiritually defeated by anger, bitterness, or a thirst for revenge. You can't really be seeking revenge on someone when you're loving them. So we want to focus on doing what is right for them and loving them for them. And so as our active and determined love for our opponent may be used by God to bring that person to repentance. An example of this is seen in Ernest Gordon's book, To End All Wars, and formerly titled Through the Valley of the Kwai. I believe that the movie Bridge Over the River Kwai is based upon this story. Gordon had been captured by the Japanese during World War II and forced with other British prisoners to endure years of horrible treatment while building the notorious Railroad of Death through Thailand. Faced with the starvation and disease of the prison camps and the brutality of his captors who killed hundreds of his comrades, Gordon survived to become an inspiring example of the triumph of Christian love against human evil. This love shone especially bright one day when Gordon and his fellow prisoners came upon a trainload of wounded Japanese soldiers who were being transported to Bangkok. Here is how Gordon describes God's work of grace. They were on their own and without medical care. Their uniforms were encrusted with mud, blood, and excrement. Their wounds, sorely inflamed and full of pus, crawled with maggots. We could understand now why the Japanese were so cruel to their prisoners. If they didn't care for their own, why should they care for us? The wounded men looked at us forlornly as they sat with their heads resting against the carriages, waiting fatalistically for death. They were the refuse of war, and there was nowhere to go and no one to care for them. Without a word, most of the officers in my section unbuckled their packs, took out part of their rations and a rag or two, and with water canteens in their hands went over to the Japanese train to help them. Our guards tried to prevent us, but we ignored them and knelt by the side of the enemy to give them food and water, to clean and bind up their wounds, to smile and say a kind word. Grateful cries of arigato followed us as we left. I regarded my comrades with wonder. 18 months ago, they would have joined readily in the destruction of our captors had they fallen into their hands. Now these same men were dressing the enemy's wounds. We had experienced a moment of grace. There in those blood-stained railway cars, God had broken through the barriers of our prejudice and had given us the will to obey his command, "Thou shalt love." Now, of course, most of us have never and hopefully never will be subject to the kind of abuse that the men building that railway had to deal, or have to reach across that great a chasm to love those who have wronged us. But as we keep these stories like Ernest Gordon's, and last week as we looked at Corrie ten Boom's stories, we keep those in mind, we're challenged with loving an enemy. The same principle applies no matter how great or small the conflict that we are involved in. As we love our enemies and seek to meet their needs, we can glorify God and protect our souls from the acid of bitterness and resentment, just as Gordon and his comrades did. And in some cases, God may use our loving acts to soften the hearts of our opponents. So that's the ultimate weapon in our battle with those who choose to be our enemies. We're not called upon to try to get even with them. We're not called to try to gossip about them or anything like that. We're called upon to do good to them, to express the love of Christ that he has for us to them. Again, this is not going to flow from our own fallen natures. It's only as we fill ourselves daily in contemplation of the love of Christ. As Ellen White says, to take that thoughtful hour each day in contemplation of the life of Christ, especially the closing events, as we picture Christ on the cross and what he has done for us, as we see that love and that mercy that God expressed, it fills our hearts, and that's what empowers us to be able to give that love to other people. To keep on praying for them, to not talk negatively about them, to always speak kindly to them, to look for opportunities to do what is good for them. And in doing so, we're doing what God calls upon us to do, and then the results are in his hands. Let's open our hymnals now.